Dean Ambrose just made the most shocking WWE return in history by appearing on SmackDown 2025 to reunite the Shield with Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins. But if you think this is a simple feel-good reunion story, you're about to discover the disturbing truth about why Dean really came back and what his true intentions are that will make you question everything about this brotherhood. What we witnessed wasn't just a surprise return, it was potentially the setup for the greatest betrayal in wrestling history, and the warning signs are absolutely everywhere if you know where to look. The sight of Dean Ambrose walking through the crowd wearing Shield tactical gear while Roman and Seth desperately fought against impossible odds created one of the most emotional moments in WWE history, but the subtle details in Dean's body language, his facial expressions, and the way he interacted with his former brothers reveal something dark and calculated that suggests this reunion might actually be the beginning of their ultimate destruction. This wasn't just unexpected, it was potentially sinister beneath the surface nostalgia. Dean Ambrose is back. The Shield is reunited. This is the moment fans have been waiting for. Those weren't just excited words from emotional commentators, they were premature celebrations from people who haven't noticed the disturbing inconsistencies in Dean's behavior that suggest his return isn't motivated by brotherhood but rather by revenge for being the Shield member who was left behind and forgotten. The enthusiasm in their voices masked the darker reality unfolding. You want to talk about returns that seem perfect on the surface but hide sinister motivations underneath? Dean Ambrose didn't just spontaneously decide to help his former brothers, his return was meticulously planned and timed to occur at the exact moment when Roman and Seth were most vulnerable and desperate, creating the perfect conditions for him to infiltrate their trust and eventually destroy them from within. The strategic precision is absolutely chilling. The setup for this return appeared perfectly orchestrated to trigger maximum emotional response. Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins were surrounded by a massive heel faction on SmackDown in what looked like a hopeless situation when suddenly the lights went dark and that unmistakable Shield siren blared through the arena, creating the nostalgia rush that made everyone's critical thinking completely shut down. But here's what makes this return absolutely suspicious and different from genuine brotherhood reunions: Dean didn't just appear and immediately help his brothers. There was a deliberate pause where he stood at the top of the ramp making Roman and Seth wait and wonder whether he would actually help them, creating psychological tension that served no purpose unless Dean was enjoying their desperation and vulnerability. The most disturbing moment that everyone missed came during the initial Shield fist bump. If you watch the footage in slow motion, Dean's eyes show absolutely zero warmth or genuine emotion. Instead, there's a cold, calculating expression that lasted only a fraction of a second before he put on the performance of brotherhood that everyone wanted to see. That micro-expression reveals his true intentions. Here's a question that's going to separate those who see the truth from those blinded by nostalgia. Did you notice how Dean's body language during the reunion showed subtle signs of resentment and barely contained rage rather than genuine joy at reuniting with his brothers? The actual fight sequence that followed was perfectly executed to appear like classic Shield coordination, but careful analysis reveals Dean was deliberately positioning himself to observe Roman and Seth's strategies and weaknesses rather than fighting with full commitment. He was gathering intelligence while pretending to be their ally. But the most revealing detail came after they cleared the ring when Dean grabbed a microphone. His speech about missing his brothers and realizing life is too short to hold grudges was perfectly scripted, too perfectly scripted. It hit every emotional beat that fans wanted to hear, which suggests it was a performance designed to manipulate rather than genuine emotion. The investigation into what Dean has actually been doing since leaving WWE reveals some disturbing details that cast his return in a completely different light. Instead of thriving in AEW and finding happiness away from WWE as he publicly claimed, sources suggest he's been increasingly bitter about being forgotten while Roman and Seth achieved greater success without him. Quick question for the psychology experts: what does it say about someone's mental state when they claim to be happy but then return to the very situation they publicly criticized? And could that return actually be motivated by revenge rather than reconciliation? The most shocking revelation is that Dean apparently reached out to WWE months ago, but not to negotiate a return as himself. He wanted to return specifically to destroy the Shield's legacy by orchestrating the ultimate betrayal that would forever taint their brotherhood in ways that his original departure never could. The testimonies from people involved in Dean's contract negotiations reveal he was obsessed with the idea of reclaiming his narrative and ensuring that history remembers him as more than just the third Shield member who left. The fixation on legacy and recognition suggests dangerous ego and resentment that could explode at any moment. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from analyzing Dean's social media activity in the months before his return. While publicly supportive of Roman and Seth's success, he was subtly liking and sharing posts that criticized them, suggested they were overrated, and claimed the Shield only worked because of his unpredictable energy. The passive aggression was constant. The pattern of public support masking private resentment is classic behavior of someone planning betrayal. Dean needed WWE and the fans to believe he'd matured and let go of grudges, but the digital footprint reveals someone who's been nursing wounds and planning revenge for years. Here's another question for the betrayal prediction experts: based on historical patterns, what percentage chance do you give this Shield reunion lasting more than 6 months before Dean reveals his true intentions? The most infuriating aspect for fans who desperately want this reunion to be genuine is how obvious the warning signs are if you're willing to see them. Dean's history of burning bridges, his documented ego issues, his public criticism of WWE followed by convenient return, all of these factors scream calculated betrayal rather than authentic reconciliation. The investigation into Dean's conversations with Roman and Seth before his return reveals they were apparently skeptical about his motivations initially. Both men reportedly questioned whether Dean could be trusted, but their desperate situation and desire to believe in brotherhood made them ignore their own instincts. That willful blindness will be their downfall. But the most shocking detail is that Paul Heyman may have been the one who actually arranged Dean's return as part of a long-term plan to eventually destroy the Shield from within. Sources suggest Heyman has been manipulating Dean's ego and resentment for months, positioning him as the perfect weapon to infiltrate and ultimately betray Roman and Seth when they're most vulnerable. The revelation that this might be orchestrated by the wise man adds layers of complexity. This isn't just Dean's personal revenge, it could be part of a larger conspiracy designed to systematically destroy Roman's support system by turning his most trusted allies against him. The fan reaction to Dean's return has been overwhelmingly positive and emotional, which is exactly what makes this situation so dangerous. Everyone is so desperate for the feel-good reunion story that they're ignoring every single warning sign that this is actually the setup for devastating betrayal. Here's a question about fan psychology: why are wrestling fans so eager to believe in happy endings and reconciliation that we ignore obvious evidence suggesting darker motivations? The most controversial aspect of this analysis is that many fans will refuse to consider the possibility that Dean's return is anything other than genuine. The emotional investment in the Shield reunion is so powerful that even presenting evidence of potential betrayal creates anger and denial rather than critical evaluation. The testimonies from wrestling historians reveal that every major Shield reunion attempt has ended badly. Their 2017 reunion was cut short by injury and Roman's health crisis. Their brief 2019 collaboration ended with Dean leaving WWE. The pattern suggests that sustained Shield unity is fundamentally impossible, making this reunion statistically likely to end in disaster. But perhaps the most important evidence comes from simple logic: if Dean was genuinely happy and fulfilled away from WWE, why would he return? The only logical explanation is either financial desperation, which his AEW salary makes unlikely, or unfinished business driven by ego and resentment that requires destroying what Roman and Seth built without him. The psychological profile of someone who returns to a situation they publicly criticized reveals someone who either never actually dealt with their underlying issues or discovered that escaping didn't provide the satisfaction they expected. Either scenario creates perfect conditions for explosive betrayal. The comparison to other famous wrestling betrayals reveals disturbing parallels to Dean's situation. Shawn Michaels' betrayal of Marty Jannetty, Seth Rollins' Shield betrayal, Kevin Owens' repeated alliance destructions, all followed similar patterns of building trust before ultimate betrayal that mirrors Dean's current trajectory. Here's a question for pattern recognition experts: how many betrayal warning signs does a situation need before we stop being surprised when the inevitable backstabbing occurs? The most terrifying implication is that Dean's betrayal might not happen immediately. The smartest approach would be months of building trust, gathering intelligence about Roman and Seth's weaknesses, positioning himself as irreplaceable, and then striking when they're most dependent on him. The long-term psychological torture would be far more devastating than a quick turn. The investigation into Dean's personality and past behavior reveals someone who holds grudges intensely and has never truly forgiven perceived slights. His departure from WWE wasn't just about creative frustration, it was about feeling undervalued compared to Roman and Seth, and that resentment doesn't simply disappear because time passes. But the most shocking theory is that Dean might actually be working with Roman's enemies to orchestrate this betrayal. The timing of his return coinciding with increased pressure on the bloodline suggests coordination rather than coincidence, meaning Dean's reunion with the Shield could be part of a larger conspiracy. The revelation that multiple heel factions backed off immediately after Dean's return creates suspicious patterns. Why would dangerous opponents simply retreat once the Shield reformed unless they knew something about Dean's true loyalties that Roman and Seth don't understand yet? The most important question is whether Roman and Seth are aware of the danger, or if they're so desperate for their brotherhood to work that they're ignoring every instinct telling them this reunion is too good to be true. Their past betrayal should have taught them to be suspicious, but hope makes people foolishly optimistic. Here's a psychological question about trauma and trust: do people who have been betrayed multiple times become more cautious about trust, or do they become more desperate to prove that trust is possible, making them more vulnerable to manipulation? The testimonies from wrestlers who have worked with all three Shield members reveal that Dean has always been the most unpredictable and emotionally volatile. While Roman and Seth matured and developed consistency, Dean's character has always been defined by chaos and inability to maintain stable relationships, suggesting this reunion defies his fundamental nature. The comparison between who Dean was before leaving WWE and who he is now reveals suspicious similarities. Despite years away and claims of growth and healing, he's essentially the same person, which suggests either he never actually dealt with his issues or he's deliberately presenting a familiar persona to manipulate his former brothers. But perhaps the most devastating outcome would be if Dean's betrayal isn't motivated by conscious malice but rather by psychological inability to maintain healthy relationships. If he wants the reunion to work but his own demons and self-destructive patterns inevitably sabotage it, that's actually more tragic than deliberate betrayal. The investigation into Dean's mental health and emotional patterns reveals concerning cycles of intense connection followed by explosive separation. He forms bonds quickly, invests heavily, then destroys those relationships when vulnerability becomes uncomfortable, suggesting the Shield reunion might be doomed regardless of intentions. The most shocking development is that some WWE officials apparently wanted Dean to return specifically because they believe betrayal is inevitable and will create massive storyline opportunities. The cynical corporate calculation that authentic brotherhood matters less than dramatic television is genuinely disturbing. Here's a question about entertainment ethics: is it morally acceptable for a company to facilitate relationships knowing they'll eventually destroy them for storyline purposes, or does that cross lines between fiction and reality? The coming weeks and months will reveal whether Dean Ambrose's return represents genuine healing and brotherhood or the most calculated betrayal in wrestling history. Every interaction, every decision, every moment of hesitation will provide clues about his true intentions. But the most important thing to remember is that hope and nostalgia are powerful blindfolds that prevent us from seeing obvious manipulation. The desire for the Shield reunion to work is so intense that fans, and possibly even Roman and Seth themselves, will ignore mounting evidence until the inevitable betrayal makes denial impossible. Here's a final question for the entire WWE universe: after examining all the evidence and warning signs, do you genuinely believe Dean Ambrose returned for brotherhood, or are you willing to acknowledge the likelihood that this reunion is the setup for the Shield's ultimate and most devastating destruction? The wrestling world is celebrating Dean Ambrose's return and the Shield reunion, but those paying attention see disturbing signs that this might actually be the beginning of their greatest tragedy. Dean didn't come back because he missed his brothers, he returned because being forgotten and overshadowed by their success without him created resentment that demands either recognition or revenge. The Shield might be reunited, but the brotherhood was broken long ago, and no amount of nostalgia can repair damage that deep. Dean Ambrose's SmackDown return created the emotional moment fans desperately wanted, but beneath the surface lies a calculated plan that will ultimately destroy Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins when they're most vulnerable. This isn't reunion, it's infiltration by someone whose ego couldn't handle being the forgotten Shield member. The betrayal is coming, and when it happens, no one should be surprised because all the warning signs were there from the very beginning for anyone willing to see past the nostalgia and recognize the manipulation.